Welcome to the Latino Leadership Circle podcast, Cafecito Conversation for November 2021. We hope that you and yours have had a wonderful Thanksgiving celebration. Recently, our beloved founder and president, Reverend David Ramos, was interviewed by Rafael Reyes III, assistant professor at New York Theological Seminary. And the talk was about engaging theology and ministry in the city. It is a wonderful and insightful talk that you are going to appreciate. Enjoy.
Welcome, class. It's great to have you all listening in or watching us on this video session. I have with me today David Ramos, who is the president of the Latino Leadership Circle. It is not only a blog post, but actually it's a think tank for the past 20 years, with discussions on Latinx culture and spiritual identity, and Latino experience in the city. I invited him because he has a rich history of being a minister in the city and engaging with other ministers in the city, preparing future thought leaders to lead with excellence. And I just want an opportunity to interview him, and maybe we can glean from his experience on preparing for us to become leaders in our spaces as we're here in seminary. So David Ramos, welcome. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Reverend Dr. Reyes, for this wonderful opportunity to be with you and to speak to your students.
Thank you. So let's jump straight into this, what I've themed engaging theology and ministry in the city. That's one of the focuses I try to bring to my students. How do we engage the theology that we're forming, and how do we engage ministry in an urban environment? And so I think one of the parts that I would like to ask you is just tell us a little bit about yourself, and some of the pathways you've gone through that might help us shed light on theology and ministry in the urban city.
Well, yeah, growing up, I always had one foot in the church and another in the community. And that could have been both culturally, but also involved with some of the political initiatives and work that was being done with regard to fair housing or injustices such as crime that was occurring. And I grew up in Sunset Park, and I remember that there was a young seminarian who was murdered, and we created a protest and in honor of him, and in light of the violence that was happening, and brought together some ministers. But what occurred at that time was that a gentleman that many of you know in the city, Reverend Dr. Raymond Rivera, founder and president of the Latino Pastoral Action Center, he had invited Luciano Padilla, who I was attending his congregation at the time, if he knew someone that'd be interested in some leadership training that encompasses community work. And he thought of me, and so he sent me, and that became a trajectory where I was raised in a certain particular consciousness, and I was introduced to Puerto Rican PhDs who had been seminary trained, and introduced to Pablo Fieri and a liberation theology. So I thought that it was a very fascinating trajectory, because here I was Pentecostal, I was in a fiery Pentecostal context. I was born and raised Catholic, Pentecostal, and then all of a sudden had this a language by which to transact reality and a way of creating frameworks. And then I was also working as a case manager. I was a case manager during the AIDS pandemic in New York City. And it was a formative role that indelibly changed my life as I worked with people on the edges of existential reality. They were dying. And so then I had two worldviews in tension. There's this Pentecostalism, and it's encasing that enabled me to survive a rather violent context where I was living at is in Brooklyn in the 80s, and you probably have no idea what that looked like for some of you, but it was very, very different than the hipster cafe avocado toast reality that we're living in now. But anyway, so then I was able to struggle with these two realities. Is how do you do Christ? How do you love in a situation of what Raymond, Dr. Rivera would say, a situation of captivity? How do you respond with grace and love to a community who is in great need? And I had to wrestle meta narratives, and then that path led me to seminary, and that path also led me to do a master's in social work, and which created this dual role of both, again, being part of the church and being part of the community as it struggles with its various realities.
That's powerful. I'm here writing notes, just jotting down some pieces, because I see that even though, you have this Catholic Pentecostal, I mean, from Catholicism, which gives you a strong understanding that God exists and functions in the world and lives in the world, that there is this spirituality that permeates.
Yeah.
But then finding in the Pentecostal space, sort of like a way in which it moves in force, right?
Yeah.
That we see the Spirit moving in a way that is more akin to Afro-Caribbean, Latino cultural environments, sort of like that Vivil, party style.
Yeah.
But I was also interested. You found the language and through that journey to engage the frameworks, and I see that the languages come out of Catholic Pentecostal and sort of like then that social work. Not even it's sort of like this activism that segues into that social work field, right? Because you had Raymond Rivera as sort of like this mentor or this example of how do we engage the community, right? He has this massive building in the Bronx, and which is a community space, and there's a lot of activities that are done there and a lot of engagement with various groups in that community. But that's a way of meeting the challenges that are there. So you have these wonderful frameworks in which to really reflect on and engage. So that's exciting. That's powerful. These various components that shape who you are. I'm grateful for that. So then you've done all these pieces, and how is that being shown today? I believe that you are part of Lead NYC. Can you explain a little bit more about that?
Sure. Just before I jump into that, I wanted to say that in Catholicism, I was very drawn to the mystics and Thomas Merton and a whole host of the Desert Fathers and Mothers, and it was this kind of contemplative Christianity, a transcendent Christianity. In Pentecostalism, it was much more of an imminent Christianity. And to quote Didi Avila, Cristo viene ya. It was very
now,
ahora. So it was very much like the kingdom breaking in, and he can heal you right now. Are you ready? So it was this wonderful combination of both this transcendent and imminent spirituality. Tell you about Lead New York. Let me kind of rewind a little bit. I wanted to share with our students that I served as a hospice chaplain for 5 years. And in there, I was directly involved with the anguish of those who were dying and their families and dealing with grief. And you can't do that without being changed, without being touched, without being transformed, and without it rattling your theological frameworks.
Yes.
And so it did. And but what it did was also enable me to understand grief at a and death and dying at a much more intimate level. So then another thing was I used to work for City to City, and I was part of a crisis care team. When the pandemic hit and we were in quarantine and everything, one of the people said, hey, we ought to address the our staff, and I was nominated to do a presentation on grief. And so then here I am, did this training on grief. That led to a whole host of other opportunities that I felt the Spirit was just creating. I ended up doing grief training for chaplain associations, for churches, for corporations. I was invited to be on a panel to talk to faith-based leaders for the office of the mayor. So then it was like the Lord just kept opening these doors. And then finally, what I would say finally, but right now, I'm the director of pastor leader care for Lead NYC, which is a strategic partnership with the American Bible Society and the Trauma Institute. And what happens is that in light of the pandemic, we have, I heard this, and it sounds really difficult to wrap myself around it, that 70% of pastors, and I guess in the survey they made, were looking for new jobs that were non-ministerial, So I was like, what? So we have pastors who are leaving the ministry. We have churches that are closing. Tragically, some, as we are aware of, have taken their own lives with domestic abuse and a whole host of problems that are in ministry. And Elite NYC is looking to provide support and help for those in the ministry and that are dealing with the ravages of what's occurred in the pandemic. And it's not just the pandemic. It's dealing with domestic violence. It's dealing with sexual trafficking. It's dealing with crime, victims of crime. So I feel very honored to have been touched to lead this initiative for Lead NYC. It's a very innovative and timely ministry at this kind of Kairos moment that we're in, to try to help provide support, emotional, spiritual support to pastors and their congregations. And in that role, we're going to be helping train facilitators to run their own healing teams in their congregations. So actually tomorrow, I'm going to be starting this trauma training myself, along with people that I've invited across the city to participate in this training. And for those who are interested, in January, we're also going to have another round of those type of trainings for those who are interested in facilitating healing groups throughout the city. We can't obviously do this alone. It's not meant to do this alone. And we're trying to support congregations to lead this and contextualize it for themselves with their communities and their particular needs.
That's amazing. And I would say I would like to have a conversation with you later on to see how maybe we at NYTS can help, either by attending those trainings and also participating in ways of spreading that message out to our students and our constituents, because we have churches that we keep in contact with, partner churches, and function in that way, and see how we can help and be a part of that. I think that would be an interesting way of engaging together, and I'm grateful for that.
Thank you.
And it's amazing that statistics, 70% of pastors.
Oh, wow.
I have some of my students that we're talking about bivocational ministry of pastors, just because of the reality of church life, of needing to have two jobs. But this is a much different statistic that you're throwing out there, which is more of, sort of like tired, or it's just not doable anymore.
Yeah, it's really hard, because I'm a pastor, and they say that the majority of congregations had a 30% loss of attendance. So you now magnify that with regards to the financial impact of these congregations. And so then a lot of times too, people are unaware of the cascading impact of the pandemic. And so sometimes they're laying the blame on leadership, on pastors. Hey, church isn't the same. We've lost a lot of people. And like, in many times that people say, what's the leader? It's the leader's fault. And then so you have pastors who had to overnight learn. They were thrusted into creating digital platforms, things that people had never done before, learning new systems, learning new ways. How do you do church in a situation of quarantine? And sometimes even working twice as hard as they did before, only to experience non-appreciation, criticism, and failure of any type of support. So it's really a difficult place. And I'm not saying that to depress you. I'm just saying it to appreciate the ministers who are doing a very, very difficult job in a very unique moment in human history.
Yeah. As you're saying those components, I think we're starting to move into this other question that I wanted to bring to you, which is the value of the urban context as we reflect on ministry. Mm-hmm. I think because it's part of Lead NYC, and so the trajectory is here in New York City, we're seeing this 70% drop. It's particular to this urban context that we exist in. And so I just wanted to ask, maybe to reflect on this urban context, what's unique about this urban context and why we need to pay attention to it, especially as we're navigating the seminary and the city.
Wow, I love this because we do some training at LLC on urban ministry. But it's very interesting that sometimes people think of urban ministry as something new. This is like it's in vogue. It's something. It's of late. No, urban ministry existed back in the early years. Paul's ministry was an urban strategy. When he did was focusing on the cities. He went to Ephesus, he went to Corinth, he went to Rome. His whole missiological methodology was to focus on cities. So it's not something new. However, we think it's kind of like a new sexy. No, it's biblical. So what happens when we look at the two major sociological phenomena, which is urbanization and globalization, it stands to reason that as ministers who intend to be missiological, is that we will have an urban strategy. However, this is one thing that happens is that one of the problems and challenges we have in churches is that the problem of tradition, the problem of that one of the slowest moving areas of innovation are the churches. So it's very difficult for us to accommodate ourselves. And I say that carefully. I don't mean accommodate by compromising, but adjusting ourselves to reality because of our traditions, because of our creeds, and then as a result, some churches, if you go to them, they seem and feel and look like they're in the 80s or in the 60s. And as a result of that, many are dying. And we find that this has been decades long. If you could study this of the hemorrhaging that is occurring in Western Christianity. This has been written on by about the global South and the new Christendom. So then I would just recommend that how do we look at being Christian in a situation of urban reality, that we need to be able to negotiate culture. We are living in a time of post-modernity. Some people would say post-Christendom, and lamentably a time of post-truth. So how are we going to be Christians in the challenge that we have? Paul faced these challenges when he was in Ephesus, when he was in Corinth, with the marketplace of ideas, the philosophical challenges, both in Corinth and Ephesus. So again, we can realize how did he deal with at the Acropolis when he dealt with the philosophers over there in the cities. So we need to negotiate the marketplace of ideas, and to do that, we don't need to curse the darkness and say, look at the people over there. Look how bad it is. Look how awful they are. Be like us, because we're pure and we got this right. That's not going to win people over. How are we going to have a mutually respectful dialogue to challenge people to truth. And I've heard someone say, hey, if we're going to have a dialogue, it doesn't help to batter someone off with like factoids and arguments, but how could you win someone over by the beauty of your ideas and the beauty of the gospel of Jesus Christ?
You know, I'm reminded of once again, Paul, when he speaks of the unknown God, in which he doesn't combat the other gods, but he just speaks about that unknown God, and starts engaging and dialoguing from that perspective. He's not battering Greek gods or the Roman gods. He's speaking of the unknown God as an avenue to or to introduce within the marketplace of ideas this alternative. And so I think that's a wonderful piece. You know, you also brought into mind something that I've been reading as if we look at the history of New York Theological Seminary and a lot of the presidents, they've been bringing forth the idea that the church doesn't do mission, but the church is mission.
Yeah.
As a way of really saying our task is not to build a church, but rather church is the world.
Yes.
That God, the divine exists in the world, and we're supposed to be attentive to that, which forces us to say, that means I don't create a countercultural within a church and everyone has to join the church, but that we bring into the world these alternative ways into the marketplace, into the space, because that's where the divine is at. That's where the divine exists. And then our call is there. And so we engage it by way of, you know, how do I bring alternatives in the spaces that I'm in, whether it's in a school, whether if it's working in human resources or this place or that place of teaching. How do I bring these perspectives into the world, because that's where the divine is at. And we listen in and we seek the peace of the city, the shalom of the city, which really, once again, forces us to have this engagement with the world, that we're not the only ones that contain truth, but we are engaging or witnessing to the truth. I think I want to say that we're witnesses to this truth that's happening, and we can see it where we see it, you know. But you're really it seems like you're really telling us that urban ministry really means to be in the urban spaces, and not to create spaces out of it where we're trying to escape into, but that's where it's at. That's where Paul was at. Paul worked, was a tent maker, you know, and that's where he was at. He was in the midst of the people. Yeah,
as I hear you, it's exciting because I'm reminded of Leslie Newbegin, and he. I was listening. I'm going to probably butcher this because it's a while back, but
no worries.
He talks about missiology, how people understood missiology, and I think in the beginning people saw it as what doctrine would it fall under, and then there was this one, and I forgot which particular one, but then people said it should be embedded in ecclesiology, you know, is the church, and finally Newbegin says no, it's pneumatology. It's in the doctrine of the Trinity.
Wow.
That's where it is, because the church is not a church with a mission. No, it's a mission that has a church. It's different. So then when we get someone, let's say like Alan Hirsch, who's a futurist, you know, he's a missiologist. He says something that's rather controversial. Because, you know, he's known as, you know, like a guru in church planting. And he goes on to say, don't plant churches. He goes, plant the gospel.
Yes.
You know? So if you plant the gospel, churches would emerge from that. But so what happens is when you have churches that are Sunday centric, you know, so it's church as event. So I create events, and then what I'm creating is passivity. I come and I watch, I sit. There's no dialogue, there's no engagement. And what I have just trained our people to do is to be passive listeners, as opposed to be a church on mission. where discipleship and the mission takes front and center. And then we'd kind of gather. I heard someone talk about refueling that just like you see the Indy 500, they're racing the track and they come in to kind of refuel, change their tires and go back on the track. That Sunday, it really is just coming in for the pit stop.
Yes.
You know, it's not the place where you get affirmed that you're a Christian, how good you are, and we do church. And no, it's the pit stop so you can go out to the world and go do mission. So it's inverting the expectation on its head.
Yes, that's wonderful. Yes. Oh, we could continue on this for a while. But I have some other questions on this.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that's phenomenal. I think this is important as we start gauging this urban context. I'm
sorry, I apologize because you had teed that up with the urban reality. I think the other part that we're missing with the urban context is that let's say in the 70s, this is like Bronx is burning, there was white flight, Times, showed the cities as urban blight. And it was this whole notion, even theological, of the city of God, city of man. The city was always sort of like a symbol of evil. Going back to studying Cain, who was the first creator of the cities, so there's this kind of theological conundrum of looking at the city as a place of maybe of sin. When we look at the parable of the prodigal son, we envision him going to the city to go hang out. You can find him in the club. You know what I mean? So it seems like it's the dirty, the big bad city, but it's in the city is where the place of grace is. It's in the city where the people are. It's in the city that we find the liminal spaces. And then even in the apocalyptic eschatological vision, we find the new city. It is. So it starts in a garden, it ends in a city. We need to have folk who love the city and who are engaged in the city, are not afraid of the city, and seek to transform the city by being Jesus in those places.
I think as a side note, it's really the city was changed in Jonah, but was Jonah changed, right? Which really calls us, are we malleable or plastic? To really see that it's not really about church, but it's about, like you mentioned, the gospel, that sharing of the good news, to reveal that there is a divine, there's a God, right? Or this reality that we're just not aware of. And it seems like that city was, once the words are spoken, they were attentive to it, most likely because of the liminal spaces that they were existing in and maybe dealing with the crises of the moment. And they needed that word and that message, that gospel. But then sometimes how the church, because of, like you were mentioning before, we can be stagnant. I think we're holding on to an image, and that image becomes stagnant, in which which needs to be broken to see God anew. That God exists in the city. So it's interesting that you mentioned, from wilderness to the city, on that, and the need for new images in that sense. I think to concretize a bit, what are some characteristics that maybe we need to be aware of in the urban space to shape our interpretive lens? And then, and I think you've been mentioning it because you did say sort of like the missiological aspect of a church. I think it's a characteristic. I think we need to be mobile in a sense. I think we need to maybe ask ourselves, where can we negotiate in the city? And I'm thinking of what are some characteristics that we do need to be aware of in the urban context, so that it shapes us. It shapes how we think and maybe can function in that context, in that space.
I think that one of our weaknesses, and this is very interesting because we tend to think of this as our strength, is that Christianity is often a proclamation. So we're used to speaking. So then what happens is that, be it from the pulpit or be it from, leadership training, we tend to own the narrative, and that, without realizing, comes from a place of pride. Like I have the goods to the kingdom, and what I need to do is share them with you. And so what happens is that
That's funny. I just want to share. That's a good one.
Yeah, no, it's very interesting.
It's an elitist perspective, right?
It is incredibly so. So, but we need a high degree of humility. Like, so my take is this: go into the city and listen, learn, be a student. Go with humility. There's so much we don't know. We operate on so many assumptions, and ask questions. Find out, find out about our Jamaican brothers, our Jewish brothers, our Muslim brothers and sisters. We have these incredible stereotypes of people and their histories, and we need to kind of silence ourselves. And so I would say, sometimes when I look, and I'm impressed by like you have quantitative research and you have qualitative research. And then when I, as a social worker, learned about kind of ethnographic studies, it comes from a much more anthropological kind of study, where you come in to observe, you come in to learn. You're not coming in to judge over and against it. You're not there to prescribe, And then when people can hear you, see that you care, it opens up the access by which you can do life together. And that mutuality of like saying, hey, you know what, I'm a broken person from a broken community, because we're all full of sin, and I'm learning and I want to give. How can I help? And then, but I also know that you're going to help me, and I'm going to learn from you. And in that space of mutuality, we could create ministry, and we could create life together. So I kind of wish that that we came in more like students as opposed to professionals.
That's a powerful piece. When we're looking at our Christian history, and you see in missiological studies how we, like you said, I have the keys, let me show you, and how it affects culture, how it destroyed culture. And I think you're asking us to do the reverse. To when we go in like Christ, like Jesus did. If we see the examples, he walks in, but he observes.
Yeah.
He listens to the stories. He's affected by the stories, and he enters into conversation with them. And then insight comes in and through that. And I think that's so powerful, and it's so opposite of what we see in our history, which may be somewhat more coercive and empire driven. And now we're seeing an honoring of cultures, in which then we could see the divine working in and through. And then we can see that sort of like kaleidoscope and rainbow spirituality that can come up from there, right? Which is, you have these diverse cultures that can speak about a divine experience, that can speak about this experience when they've been given the space for that.
Yeah. I think that there is a human nature to use meta-narrative to ward off our existential anxiety. So then I fear death, let's say. So then my meta-narrative, Christianity enables me to ward off my anxiety of the fact that I'm mortal, So then, if anything were to challenge my meta-narrative, I become defensive, because it's scary. Now you're challenging my meta-narrative. So now it's almost like no holds barred. Like, no, you're wrong. And but we don't realize that unconsciously,
Correct.
What happens is the questions and or the someone else's narrative challenges our own. And rather than saying, immediately saying, hey, you're wrong, I could just say, well, that you have an interesting meta narrative, and that may work for you. I disagree with it. I have my own set, but it doesn't make you my enemy. It doesn't make you my enemy. I could
Correct.
still be loving to you, even though I don't agree with you politically, socially, culturally, ethically, morally. I'm operating from a meta narrative that I also realize that I look through the glass darkly. I have to realize that I don't have this all figured out.
Definitely.
I think that once we enter into a place where we think we got it all figured out, I think that makes people dangerous.
Yes.
Because you think that you got this right. And it's easy to clobber people. It's easy to demonize the other when you think that you have access to truth, capital T.
That's awesome. As you filled it in, I was going to ask you, because we're at that time where we're going to be ending, if you can offer advice one piece of advice to seminary students as they're navigating through this experience. But I think you're kind of giving that to us right now. Mm-hmm. The necessity of being humble, of listening, developing the acts or the methodology of observation, to say we don't have it. And part of our time at seminary is to develop tools and skills, not to say we have it, but to learn to listen more, to learn to observe, and to see the divine in the midst of that, and then speak to that.
I appreciate, that's a great question. And I have with a little bit of time, my encouragement, this is a kind of paradoxical, is I love one of Mother Teresa's quotes. She says, don't wait for leaders, which I thought was great.
That's amazing.
Yeah, don't wait for leaders. And then, so what happens is oftentimes we seek permission. We seek validation. And what happens is sometimes the custodians of particular movements can crush you. So now here's the paradoxical thing. We both need community, and sometimes community can be confining, right? So then this is the issue. Some people say, well, I don't need the church. I don't need Christianity, And then what happens is deconstruction is very popular right now, and sometimes for good reason. Because there has been abuses. So when you look and you say, hey man, this is wrong. This is just ethically wrong. I could see why deconstruction can be a real possibility for people. So what happens is that people unfetter themselves from community, of which I believe, this is my thing, that the church is part of God's kingdom design, imperfect as it is. So we need community because community humanizes us, community affirms us. We're going to be in spiritual deserts. I need you, you need me. And I believe, in perfect as it is, we need communities. And on another note, but community can confine you, it could constrain you, it could crush you, and it could dehumanize you, and it could deform you. So there are times when you need to say no. You need to unfetter yourself. You need to have enough constitutional identity of which to rise over and against community when it in fact crushes you, or you find it to be toxic, or find it to be a place that ironically sometimes ends up being the very thing it rails against. As contradictory, how crazy that is, sometimes I feel some of the most pernicious sins come from our own circles. And I look and I say, wow, this is really, really sad and depressing. And so I would hold those two tensions of saying, hey, listen, I need community. How do I create community? Yeah, sometimes you have to create your own circles and of flourishing in your own circles of life. They do become a lifeline. And that is one of the reasons why Latino Leadership Circle emerged, was creating a lifeline for young emerging leaders at the time. We're older now, but also sometimes you were going to be forced to be a pioneer, and they kill prophets, by the way.
Yes.
So there are times where, living your call is a dangerous endeavor. But if God called you and you are obedient to the Spirit of God and to the gospel of Jesus Christ, he promises to be with us in the midst of all that.
Thank you. Wow, that's powerful. That's powerful. The paradox of community and the necessity of community, because we see God working, the divine working in and through community.
Yes.
Regardless. So that's, it's what's interesting, because I see that piece can permeate even beyond Christianity to other religious traditions, that in the community, we see the divine at work, or the ultimate reality at work. And that if we're by ourselves, we can't see that happening. But we have this danger of the paradox of being in both places. That's where we exist in, but that's where we can see things happening in powerful ways. And that's powerful. I want to have to think about that a little bit more. There's so much more we can unpack, but I think we're going to stop here. I want to thank you, David, for this time. It's been precious. It's been wonderful conversation. I took a bunch of notes, which I'm probably going to have to go back on a later time when we get together.
You're going to hang out, man.
Yes, and unpack a little bit more. I want to thank you, though. I want to thank you for this time. This is so important. We need to be hearing from the voices of leaders here in the city, and I'm glad that I was able to have time to speak with you today. It's truly been an honor.
It's an honor for me, Dr. Reyes, and I look forward to more discussions and collegial work, and please let me know how I can help with on the Lead NYC side, and maybe some of your students would want, or leaders and pastors would like to get engaged in this. Amen.
Thank you, and I'll definitely be looking into it right after this. All right, have a wonderful, blessed day, and class, I'll see you again.